Hey, folks, and welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I've got a great guest, Dave Jacinto. I hope I said that right. He'll tell me in a second. Not the Dave bit, the Jacinto. I think I can do Dave, but he'll tell me. He's in San Diego in California. California is one of my favorite places. So it's early morning for him, and it's early evening for us here in the UK. Dave's going to talk about himself and his book. He's an author. He's written what looks like a really interesting book about a tragedy that happened in the UK, in fact, in a mining village that changed child labour laws. So we'll be looking at that issue. Really piqued my interest because I'm really interested in child welfare issues and issues of children and trafficking and exploitation, etc. And so these are some of the really interesting themes that are around. As it's pre-record, don't call because I won't be on the phone. But do send me a message. And if you've got questions for myself or for Dave, just message them through is the best thing on my WhatsApp, which is 07506319745. That number will be underneath the video when it's out. And if you've got questions for Dave, I'll pass them on to him. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them as well. And do buy his book. We'll put a link to it as well. So that's enough for me. And over to you. Hello, Dave. Welcome to the Wellbeing Show.
Thank you, Noel. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, especially across the pond.
Yes. And I was saying to you before we kicked off that I was over there during the summer with my son. It was his first trip to California. I have to say, California is one of my most favorite places on the planet. It really is. It's an extraordinarily, if people haven't been, go. It's just gorgeous place and an amazing lifestyle. One of those places we couldn't do it this time because the skiing season had finished, but one of those places you can literally in the morning ski, jump in your car, and then in the afternoon surf. I mean, it's ridiculously gorgeous lifestyle. You're in San Diego?
Yes, as a matter of fact, our family does a lot of that surfing. That's kind of a
Yeah.
big part of life here. We have our home here in a little town called Encinitas, which is part of San Diego. It's just on
Yeah.
the coast, a little coastal town, and then we have a
Encinitas is
place
beautiful. It's
up.
gorgeous. Yeah.
You know that area?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful beaches here. But I have to say, I love London. I worked for a time for a company called Barrett Homes,
Yeah.
which is an English out of Manchester. And we spent quite a bit of time in London touring different projects that they were doing and learning about London. And I hadn't known much about it before I started this process of going over there every year with this company. And fascinating, the history that we take for granted, that you take for granted, I think, there is so unusual to us here in California because California is basically a new state. I mean, here, if it's older than 50 years, it's a historical monument.
I know it's a really strange thing. We've got gravestones older than far older.
Right. I mean,
Well,
walk down the
when you come over, I'll take you to some of my favorite old places. There's some really
right.
interesting places. Southwark Cathedral is a real must because it's at the birthplace of London, Southwark Cathedral. So London built up around a bridge that the Romans built to get to their capital, called London Bridge.
Well, I
And
remember going down the Thames with a tugboat with Barrett, and we were having lunch on this tugboat. They'd set it up as a whole kind of an outdoor restaurant in the
right,
summertime. We were going down the Thames, and we passed a point where there was a dock, and the dock they were doing a project off this dock, and they called the project Virginia Keys. And I said, "No, why'd you call it Virginia Keys?" He said, "Well, this is where the Pilgrims took off
that's
to
right.
settle America." And I thought, I can't imagine if
Yeah,
that were in the United States, you wouldn't be able to touch it
yeah.
because it's such a historical element.
I've had a beer in a pub just there. There's a pub which you can overlook the Thames itself. It's on stilts, and you can actually see the water through the floor. Sort of on a summer's day, on a winter's day, I wouldn't recommend being outside. It's sort of being cold. So yeah, I know what you mean. And it's an interesting place, and that's sort of the theme today is this sort of historical connections, and the interconnectedness is one of those things. Are you
Right.
from California originally, from San Diego yourself, or
Well,
what's
I'm from California, from the
yeah,
northern part of California. My family's been here for 5 generations,
great.
which is a very, very long time in California. Most people have been here for 5 years,
Yeah.
but yeah, we've been here for a long time.
Okay. And the north being San
Well,
Francisco,
north between
far north?
Sacramento and San Francisco.
Right. Okay. And San Francisco is also another amazing place. So, what brought you? Where did your family come from originally? Then.
Well, originally, my father's family is from the Azore Islands, off of Portugal. My mother's family, which frankly relates to this story, is from South Yorkshire, England.
Okay.
That's in part how we get to the story, which I'm sure when you ask me questions about that, I'll tell you a little bit more.
Yeah. And so you grew up in California, normal California boy,
I
listening,
was
driving a hot rod.
well, not driving a hot rod so much, but I did grow up and spend a lot of time down on the coast, and that's why we ended up here.
Okay.
Because I found, that if I have 4 children and 13 grandchildren, so I found that if you make your children very interested in surfing and the beach and that kind of thing, they're unlikely to move away. They may move away for a short time, but they all want to come back. And so all 4 of my children
Great.
live within 20 minutes.
Great. Great. And were you a surfing dude yourself? I mean, were you five,
Yeah, I did quite
610,
a bit.
that sort of television program type thing?
I did quite a bit up in the Bay Area, and then of course, since I've been down here for 40 years, I've done a whole lot more.
Yeah. And what, you were in real estate? Is that the connection with Barrett? I mean, they're a building
Yes, as a matter of
company.
fact, for a number of years, I was in real estate development, and a portion of that time, I worked for various companies before I went out on my own company. But for a portion of that time, I was the director of development for Barrett Homes, and so I spent time both in the UK and in the US on
Yeah.
various different uh, projects.
And your partner's British as well, did you say? She's from Wales.
Well, my wife, yes, she's
Yeah.
from Cardiff, and she was born there, came over here as a youngster,
Uh-huh.
uh, immigrated to America, and her family was in the coal mines, and so she's obviously very interested in this book and all that that entails.
Yeah. I mean, they're sort of mining the valleys, as it's called, the Welsh valleys, etc. Sort of a long history steeped in hard labor, mostly mining, all of which sort of was shut down really in the UK. The sort of coal mines were shut down by previous government. Margaret Thatcher, you may have heard of her, sort of ended that story. I guess your wife knows that name. sort of,
Absolutely, my
so,
wife is familiar with Margaret Thatcher.
yeah, yeah. So,
Actually, Sir Laurie Barrett was worked with Margaret Thatcher. He was her housing advisor.
ah, yeah. Well, she, of course, brought in big changes in the housing market in the UK and allowed people to buy their sort of social housing and things like that, which, I don't really have an opinion on, but that's what happened in terms of creating. But it's really, I'm intrigued. So for, a US businessman who was involved in real estate to, and I'm like going, what are the dots we need to join up that gets this guy interested in stories about child exploitation? Because that's not the standard sort of background, I guess. You're sort of involved in these businesses. So first of all, I guess, I mean, how did you get into writing full stop? If you're going from this competitive real estate world, I guess doing sales, but also doing other things, that's a very
Well, because I was in the development part, that meant I spent a lot of time with different public agencies and groups that make those kinds of decisions, both in the UK and the US, mostly in the US. I
Right.
spent a lot of time speaking to various different bodies,
Uh-huh.
and I had a number of speaking engagements on a whole myriad of things. But one of the things I love to do is tell stories about all sorts of things, a lot of them related to my own life. But in this particular case, um, my mother, who was dying of cancer, lived on the other side of the United States. She lived in Louisiana,
Mm-hmm.
and I lived in, of course, San Diego. And I had written a book called Christmas Kindling, which was a bunch of Christmas stories, a
Yeah.
lot of which I had told in these various speaking engagements. And it was published by a small publisher out of the Midwest. And she heard about it and wanted to hear about the book, but it hadn't quite been published yet. So she asked me to read her some of the stories. So I hopped on a plane in San Diego and flew to Louisiana, which is about almost 3,000 miles.
I know it's huge. People don't realize how big the US is. It's
Yeah, it's big. It's not like the UK.
no, not at
So
all.
we flew across country and met with my mom, and she was a lot sicker than I had expected. She was in the last stages of cancer, and so the first day I was there, I read her two stories out of the book, and she was fascinated by these stories. They were
Mm.
about children and about our children and about my growing up and a whole bunch of things but they're Christmas stories like you'd expect Christmas stories to be. And as a result, she started talking about her family. And
Wow.
my mom was an orphan, and I didn't know anything about her real family, but she apparently knew quite a bit more than she'd ever shared with us. And so these stories, um, and the fact that she was nearing death, made her think about that family. And for a week, for 8 days, I was there. I read her all 16 stories over those 8 days, and she told me everything about this family that she had in Wyoming and who had immigrated from England. And I didn't know anything about it. And at the
Wow.
end of that time, she passed away within hours of that last day, and still very coherent. Matter of fact, the last thing she asked me before she passed away a couple hours later was, "When I get better, will you take me down to Cabo San Lucas so I can see you surf?" And I said, "As soon as you get better, Mom." She never got
Thanks.
better,
I'll get
and
you
she
aboard and
passed.
we'll be doing it together.
And when she passed away, she asked to be buried in this little cemetery in Wyoming. So we did. We had a memorial service and up in this cemetery in this little town by Chalk Creek in Wyoming. Never been to it before. And it was a family plot that I knew nothing about. And the largest two tombstones in the entire cemetery were my great great grandparents,
Wow.
born in the 1830s. And I was shocked.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I immediately became fascinated by this family I knew nothing about. And this little town in Wyoming above Park City, if you've ever heard of that, it's a pretty famous skiing place.
Okay.
It's very close to Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City has the biggest genealogical library in the world.
Yeah.
And so I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could go down to Salt Lake and find out about this family that I had that I didn't know anything about? So I did. That afternoon, I spent the entire afternoon with these little ladies, these little docents surrounding me, showing me how to get this information out of the computer and out of their files. And I left with a stack of information about
Wow.
this family from the UK, and it was fascinating. So that very next day, which was a Sunday, I went to back to that little town, and nothing was open on Sunday. But I went to a church and found out who this director of Summit County was, and after a conversation on the phone, she was kind enough to, on a Sunday, open up the county
No, get
building
out of here.
the entire day, going
Wow.
over all these records and information, and I was hooked. And for 2.5 years, I researched everything I could about their life in the UK and
Yeah.
then their subsequent life in the U.S. And so I ended up writing two books. The one is about growing up in a coal mine as a very, very young child. And the second is about, and of course, all the things that happened after that. And the second is about their time in the U.S.
Extraordinary. What an extraordinary story, Dave. That's really touching and moving.
Fascinating.
Really touching and moving. I love this idea that you shared your creativity with your mum, and you shared that together as she sort of exited this world and whatever happens next. And then she sort of was really inspired, it sounds, by your sort of by your stories. I remember when I first trained, I trained in creative therapies, and um, we did whole stuff on storytelling and story making and myths, and this thing that human beings have from the oral tradition. Because writing is good, computers are good, and all that sort of stuff. I like technology, but there's something very special about somebody telling us a story. And there's something
I
very
think that's
deep and
right. I mean,
meaningful about that.
I found as I mentioned, I did a lot of speaking engagements and
Sure.
a lot of efforts to get projects approved. And even in those public hearings where you have the time, I found that stories really help to soften the relationships between those that
Yeah.
you're dealing with and bring out the humanity. And it's amazing how many things can be accomplished starting with a story and then
Yeah, I
moving on.
agree. I agree.
So,
There's something about identification, I think, that when we hear somebody's story, whether it's our own or somebody else's story that we're sharing, we as human beings can find common ground with
right.
experience. Even if it seems very, very distant, like this particular story is set in the past at a historical moment, but the experiences of human beings, whatever period of time, is something that we can identify with and
Well,
understand.
I'll tell you something, just a little side note on that.
Yeah.
They end up in a little town in Wyoming, as I mentioned, in this place called Chalk Creek and close to Park City. Um, that woman who helped arrange that meeting and at the county building and did a lot of research for me over that 2.5 years, became fascinated by the whole subject.
Yeah.
And a few weeks ago, invited me up to Wyoming to speak in three different engagements. Now, remember, my mom was an orphan, so I grew up with no relatives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really, she grew up in Hollywood with a great aunt. My great aunt died fairly young, and so I had no relatives on that side. And I went up to this little town in Wyoming, and it was packed
Get out
with
of here.
relatives. And one of the events was arranged by this historical director and a relative. And they gathered all these people together, 60, 70 people, most of which had a connection in my genealogical past.
Wow.
And I told stories about the book, about how it came about, and a whole bunch of things. And the idea was to be there for maybe 20 minutes, tell a few things, and then I would sign books and that kind of thing. I ended up talking an hour and a half
Yeah.
and then just opening it up for questions from all these relatives. I asked those folks there were probably 60, 70 people, all those to raise, all those who are related to me and the main characters to raise their hand. And about 40 of them rose their hand. And I thought, okay, I've got 40 cousins out there I didn't even know I had.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
It is extraordinary. I mean, it's absolutely inspirational stuff. It really is. The power of us sort of being inspired by each other and finding our connection. In your case, actual genealogical connections. And it's an extraordinary story, I think, in some ways as well. This connection across time and space as well. So there you are in San Diego. What on earth could you have connected to the UK? And yet here you are deeply rooted, actually, in that because of these patterns of migration. So tell me, why did your family leave the UK? What's the story there? We're going to come
Well,
to.
that
I just want people
unfortunately
folks to
that
know the
was,
book is Out of Darkness, and we will put a link to it because it's fascinating. But what was the story about your family migrating then?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that, but unfortunately, that's really the essence of the book. I mean,
Yeah.
let me just start by
Not
saying this.
unfortunately, just tell us that story so that we understand.
Okay, well, they were in effect driven out of the UK.
Okay.
In the end of this story, um, there is a conflict between powerful aristocracy and this coal mining family, and he has by this time become very well respected technically.
Okay.
He is a he's a
I'm going to stop you
brilliant.
there. So, what I want you to do now is just tell us the story of this novel, of this book that you've written. So, take us through that. So, let's hear that story. Give us a précis of that, and then we'll know
Okay.
who the characters are. Okay, and then we can make the links between experience. Does that make sense?
All right. Well, let me tell you. You're asking me to tell you a little bit about
Yeah.
the story. The thing I think that you're most interested in here is the part one of the book. Part one of the book is about a family that the father has been in the coal mining industry for generations.
Yeah.
They've lived in these little miner shanty in and around Silkstone, which is an area just outside of Barnsley, um, for over 100 years. And he can't read. He is uneducated except for mining. And in mining, he is pretty well respected because he's that kind of a personality. His wife, you have to read a little bit more about the story to find out exactly how they get together, but she had worked as a maid for Lord Fitzwilliam.
Hmm.
Lord Fitzwilliam owns the Wentworth Woodhouse mansion. It's this family, the coal mining family, is living in a 10 by 12 miner shanty with a family of six. Lord Fitzwilliam, with a family of six, is living in a 252,000 square foot home.
Mm.
It's the biggest country home in all of the UK.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is ginormous on 14,000 acres. He controls and owns 85,000 acres. Well, Martha, Thomas's mother, the main character, had worked as a maid. She actually was sold as an indentured servant into that home and grew up in that home, and herself became very well self-educated because she has access to the biggest library in the entire UK, and she becomes a voracious reader, reading at night by candlelight. And through a series of events that you have to read the book to find out, she is immediately leaves that home and marries this coal miner, and they have obviously two different visions of what they want for their children.
Sure.
He assumes they will be coal miners for the rest of their lives. Thomas, the main character, as Joseph, his father, and his father before, goes in the mine on his seventh birthday. And as far as Joseph is concerned, he's going to be in the mine until he dies.
Yeah.
They all are.
Yeah.
And it's foolishness for his wife to suggest anything else because that's the way it works.
Hmm.
And that's the way it's been, and that's the way it's always going to be. She, on the other hand, is desperate to have her children be educated. And from the moment they can open their eyes, she's educating them
Mm.
until they go to the coal mine. And then it's more of an extended education. So that's the beginning of the story. And that's how it begins. You have that conflict between husband and wife in a patriarchal society where
Mm.
he makes decisions.
Mm.
And it's difficult because she wants one thing and he says, don't be foolish. You'll paint dreams. It'll never happen.
Yeah. And then the progression of the story is we get as the children go, because the children go down at the age of 7, and which is horrifying to think of. You know that we've got we're not that far away from that, but the story leads up to quite a sort of cataclysmic event, doesn't it, in that
Right.
mine? So
Right. That particular mine, some of you might know, um, has a disaster in 1838. He's 8 years old at the time, and 26 children are killed.
mm,
Uh, and it creates a shock wave all over the UK.
Yeah.
And his mom, Thomas's mom, Martha, who is educated, becomes one of the mothers who joins together with other mothers to protest mining of, this um, child labor.
Yeah.
And child labor, of course, is rampant all over the UK at the time. The average lifespan of a child in the Industrial Revolution is 22.
Yeah.
They don't live very long
Yeah.
because they start in these industrial circumstances, and in the mine's actually a little better than some of them, but they don't. It's a very difficult thing, and so she's adamant about her children and other children being pulled out of the mine, and she joins with the Lord Ashton, and they in turn influence a young Queen Victoria. She's like 17 or 18 years old, but she is aghast at this whole concept of child labor, and they change a few of the laws in Parliament. Not enough. But one of the laws they change, of those 26 children, 11 of them were little girls. So the law they change in 18, what is it, 1842, is that girls can no longer be working in the mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so that one at least changes. The little boys are still allowed to go in the mines, and they still suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't happen until much later, when Thomas, who catches the vision and has actually pulled out of the mine for a long time until his father gets really sick, and he has to be pretty much the sole breadwinner. He has to go back in the mine. But in that time, he becomes very educated, and he is passionate about learning outside the bubble of that little area in which they live, and learning about different technologies that might make things safer for those who work in the mine, and also trying to get children out of the mine. And that creates a bit of a conflict with the aristocracy at the time, because that's a big source of their income, especially in that area. And it's a big problem because back in that point in history, the aristocracy made the laws, and they were not particularly subject to the laws. They made them and enforced them. Even at the end of the book, there's an inquest into an event that happens, and they're all adults now, and it's 30 years later. But in this inquest, which is forced upon the owners of the mine, where almost 400 miners, boys and men, are killed, they pick those who do the review. They pick the board of inquest, the owners, and it's a foregone conclusion that they're not going to suffer any repercussions for the lack of safety measures in those mines. But the goal is to get it out to the press, to get it out to those in London, in other parts of the world, so they can see what's happening. And so maybe a Queen Victoria, who was a champion for these kinds of issues, might get behind it, and over the years force Parliament. And that's kind of what happens, is that it makes such an impact, and it's so alarming to most folks in the UK that public opinion drives change.
I think there's a lot of really rich threads and themes that I'd like to sort of just discuss a little bit, if that's okay with you. Sure. So there's this issue about social change and how that comes about. And again, there's something in there for me about identification of human themes between people. So you've got this working class woman who is inspired by the idea of education, which would have been new at the time, sort of very forward thinking. Somehow managing to get her story, the experience of these children, which is part of her story, to the head of state, the Queen at the time. And that person, the head of state, seemingly, who would, I guess on one level, seem like completely disconnected from any of this reality, but responding as a human being with her feelings about stuff. And it makes me think of, we still have the royal family, as you know. But I think of, for example, that's one of the stories about Princess Diana, was her humanness, her
Right.
capacity to emotionally identify with and connect with the experience of other people. And she did those famous things about making physical contact with AIDS patients, etc., etc., and the things that she influenced and changed. And these people can be really important, but it's also the other side of that story. And then we have the issue, and I think this is relevant to today in particular, that people don't know how awful some other people's lives can be. That we
Right.
just don't know. And when
Right.
we do know, we then go, well, that's dreadful. This shouldn't be right. And that seems like a very important theme here.
Right. I think, you made a very excellent point, Noel. First of all, you mentioned Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is young when this first story occurs. I think she takes the throne at 16 in 1837. This is 1838. That means she's 17 years old.
Yeah.
Um, she's a passionate young woman, though. And especially when she's young, she wants to fight against these kinds of things. She marries a man who wants that wants the same. And so they have a little bit different approach to a royal family that maybe other earlier royal families have had.
Yeah.
And so that helps if you have a little bit of a catalyst to
Yeah.
get her charged up, that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah.
And you have Martha. Martha is a very interesting character, and she's a secondary character in this book. You don't know all these things about Martha until later in the book, but her role is this strong mother, strong, quiet, determined mother who is educated. In
Yeah.
these little towns, they knew their bubble, and that is it.
Yeah.
But she had a wide view of the world because she was well read. And so she uses what influence she has with her children first to to help them to gain a similar view of the world.
Yeah.
And when this event happens and they lose those 26 children and they're buried in mass graves and they don't even have enough money from the company to even pay for the funerals,
Yeah.
it is jarring to her, having worked in a mansion like she did for her whole upbringing and
Mhm.
seeing the wealth that some had. She couldn't imagine that happening and was incensed at herself, to be honest with you, to begin with, that she allowed her children to work in those circumstances
Mhm.
and insisted that they not do that anymore. They're out. And her husband, of course, was very upset about it, but she was a strong woman and
Yeah.
she pulled him out and she joined with other mothers and worked to address this issue to some degree. And she didn't have a lot of influence. Of course, you wouldn't. All the rules and laws or everything are made by this aristocracy, and you really had no role in it. And frankly, it irritated a lot of the wrong people. And that is another theme that runs through the entire book of this constant irritation that this family has on those who ruled their lives and owned the mortgages in their lives.
Mhm.
And it builds to a crescendo at the end. And you were asking why they left the country, and that's part of why they left the country. They were driven out of the country.
Yeah. And they were driven out, and then they went to the US because it was more welcoming. Again, it's quite extraordinary that rather than bow down and say, right, we've lost, they moved on,
Right.
to achieve. And it's a great story, that and that idea. And again, that brings up another theme for me, which is around, and we discussed this a little bit before the show, and which is this: people are. I mean, this word migration and moving that's in this
Right.
story, isn't it? These people migrated. They migrated for a combination of economic and political persecution reasons.
Right.
Um, and here you are, this amazing guy called Dave, who's got an extraordinary family and contributes fantastically to the world. That's why you exist, right? Because of all these things that happened and these families moving. You're an immigrant. You're a product of immigration, and you're an amazing contributor to the life in California. What happened that immigration became such a dirty word. I mean, it confuses me. An immigrant. My parents are Irish, they're both dead. Um, the Irish diaspora, I think I've heard there's more Irish people around the globe than in Ireland. And if they all went back, the economy would collapse probably. So yeah,
Right. Well, we probably have more Irish in New York and that area than
well,
you have in Ireland.
quite, and this story of people moving um to improve their lives is a very common human story, right?
Well, it's interesting. I think if you look at Joseph, the father in this family,
Yeah,
his only education is what it takes to be a miner. And all of his life and all of the life of those who went before know the coal mine. They know their little village or
yeah,
maybe a couple of miles outside that village. They don't know anything about London. I
yeah,
mean, an enormous trip for them would be to go to London. Nobody in his family had ever been to London. And for them, they entered the mine. Let's just step back here for a second.
go on.
Thomas enters the mine at age 7 on his 7th birthday. He can
Yeah,
read, he can write. He looks like that little boy on the cover.
yeah,
For 6 days a week, he goes into the darkness before the sun comes up in the morning and leaves before or after the sun goes down at night. The
yeah,
only day he sees sun is Sunday.
yeah,
He's not even given a single candle. Most of his time is lived in these little tunnels that are 2 to 3 feet by 2 to 3 feet wide. Most of the kids don't get a single candle. He gets one because his mother insists that he gets one candle for a 12-hour workday, which lasts, a couple hours. The rest of the time, he's in the darkness. His only real close companions are rats. Some of those rats are so big. I did a bunch of research on them. Some of them are 2 feet tall. They're
yeah,
big.
yeah,
And I can't imagine looking at that child on the front of the book, which happens to be my grandson. And every time I thought of what Thomas must do at that age, I looked at him and said, what would he do? How would he react? How terrified would he be?
yeah,
And when
exactly.
you do that and you realize how difficult it is, um, you can see how life would be a challenge. When these guys got out of the mine, they would go to the pub and they would spend the miners would spend their evening in the pub and then they'd
Yeah,
come home to their kids. Their kids were in bed and that's their life. They'd make a little bit of money working in the mine and they'd spend most of it in the pub.
yeah, yeah,
Gave a little bit to the family to survive. And they were so busy worrying about survival, they didn't think of anything else. This particular family had an influence that most others didn't have. They had a mother who was educated, and she wanted different things for them. And so all the way through the story, these kids are catching the vision of what it is that she's trying to share with them. And by the end, they have this feeling of America being something that, frankly, it's not entirely. I mean, they felt they could find gold in the streets. They could go over there and get huge pieces of land, and it would be easy for them. It's not easy. It's very
mm,
difficult. But that was the vision that I think a lot of immigrants had at the time. They were raised in these awful conditions, and they were basically driven out. And in his case, he was actually driven out. And they went to the place where they thought life was going to be great.
mm,
And for a lot of them, it turned out pretty good. But for that first generation, maybe not so much because it was very difficult. But there was something about America at the time that the UK didn't have. The government here in America at that time, and not so much now, but at that time, was instituted for one reason only: to ensure that the individual could rule his own life. It
mhm,
was there as a protector of the individual, like a referee in a football game, not a player in the game,
mhm,
but just to make sure that the rules were followed and things happened fair. Now that didn't always happen, but that was the concept, that was the idea. And so the individuals, and we have a phrase in the Declaration of Independence that says it's a government for the people, by the people, governed by the people.
Yeah.
And the idea is that the individual could do things that they could never do in the UK.
Yeah.
These families, coal miners' family, were going to be there for another 100 years in that coal mine. Instead, they ended up coming to America. They got 160 acres with creeks and ponds, and they raised a family, and the whole
What's
life
interesting
changed.
me, I mean, you won't know about this. There's this thing in the UK at the moment called the small boats problem. It's ridiculous terminology, which is migrants who are trying to join their family in the UK. I told you before, my background is in refugees and stuff like that. So I'm quite well informed by all this sort of stuff. And I'm interested because I think, and I don't know if this is true, but I think if we got some of those folks from the boat, once they've got over their trauma of crossing the channel, which is what's going on at the moment, and we shared this novel, this story that you've written, which is based on actual people and actual events and part of your story, that I think they would find huge amounts of common themes in their current lives. That these are the things that are motivating them in very much in similar ways to your family when they decided that they had to move. So this thing of there's a I mean I guess there is something about I can't imagine, I have moved, but I genuinely, like most people on the planet, I find a safe home and I ensconce myself, and that's what we do. The thought of just moving somewhere across the world on a whim that's not what happens, right? Generally, it doesn't, okay, some super wealthy people might do it, but most of us, we don't do that. We are pushed and pulled by circumstances. And the idea of traveling across the globe to try and make a better life is not an easy thought or decision. Wasn't then, it wouldn't be now. And it's a very powerful story. And it's also made more powerful because one of the central themes is this idea that you've talked about again and again, that education, this woman was educated. She educated her children, and how that freed her mind.
Right.
So not to just
She was able to
programming.
see. I think we take it for granted now. We're such a mobile society anyway.
Yeah.
I know folks in the UK have a pretty good arrangement for vacation time because we have a lot of them visit
We
here,
have
like
much
you.
better time than you.
Yeah, and they've seen parts of the world, all over the
Yeah.
world. They've been everywhere. They've been all over Europe. They've been all over the U.S. Some of them a lot more around the U.S. than I have, and we take it for granted. We have the internet. We have what you and
Yeah.
I are doing right now,
Absolutely.
being able
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Yeah.
talk about all these things.
And it
Back
became
then,
very powerful, of course, during the lockdown and
right,
the time of COVID. Suddenly, we realised that we are actually very connected because, and what would life have been like if we'd had all of that and no Zoom meetings and it would have been pretty dire, I think.
right. There's a scene. There's a scene in this book
Yeah.
when things are not going well for Lord Fitzwilliam, who historically has basically controlled everything and everybody around him, and things are not going well for him. And he gets very upset and he says, the worst thing we ever did was allow that woman to learn to read. We wouldn't have done that. We wouldn't have had these problems.
Great. He's right.
He's right.
Education is the key here. I want to bring in another theme because it is of interest and we are running out of time. I told you we would get through this really quickly. And that of child exploitation, which is, a very powerful theme in this story. and the desire of at least one parent and maybe several to protect their children from this exploitation. So talk us through what happened in terms of the changes in law and your understanding of some of those themes, and what struck you. And you've begun to talk about it because you said the child who's on the book is actually related to you, and you try to imagine him crawling around with those rats. It's a horrific thought, right? So tell us a little bit about that story. What changed because of this?
Okay, well, let me just say this. One of the reviewers of this book is a guy named Tim Ballard, and he's done a movie recently called The Sound of Freedom. It may not be that well known in the UK, but it's extremely well known here, and it's about child trafficking in today's world. And he is a fighter of child trafficking around the world. He's working in 20 different countries, in 20 different states, and he has a huge organization now. And he reviewed, if I would suggest that you look on Amazon or any other place, and you'll see his review right on the top. And he talks about that subject in his review. And I think here it becomes such a problem for Martha, who is the mother, that she starts after this first event working on child labor, fighting child labor. And then, of course, Thomas does too. And throughout the book, it is a theme that carries through. In the end, there is a giant inquest about a mine explosion called the Oaks, which is in Hoyle Mill, which is just by Barnsley. And 384 men and boys are killed. And as I mentioned, that story went around the UK. Every newspaper in the UK carried it and was there day after day after day. And everyone became concerned about what was happening. And there were a series of laws that were changed. And one of them was in 1874, where they changed child labor from children that could go in at any age. They at least made it, they had to be 12 years old and no girls, and a whole bunch of other rules for safety that they hadn't had before. In the Oaks, for example, they had that tragedy that killed 384 people, but over the 20 years that led to that, well, 25 years, they had a series of 9 other tragedies along that same seam of coal that killed more than 500 men and boys and girls. And they'd done nothing about it. And they'd had no real press about it. Well, in that inquest, that's one of the things the main character does, being educated. He's on the stand, and he goes through each one of those incidents and talks about each of them and what was done after to make the mine safer, and virtually nothing was done. And that incensed those around the UK, and it made him aware of what was happening. And laws were passed. There's other laws as well related to match girls and a few other things that you're familiar with. And it's tied into this to a degree.
And we tend to think, and it still is the case in the UK, that the minimum age for working for a child is 12. That hasn't changed. That law is still on the books. And we tend to think, and I think this is the interesting thing, that we tend to think that this issue no longer exists in certain countries. But it's not true. And I think your reference to the guy who does child trafficking, and I can tell you from my professional experience, children are trafficked into every major country around the world and are exploited.
Absolutely. Well, as a matter of fact, I have an interview tomorrow with the local San Diego paper. It's the biggest one we have. It's called the Union Tribune. And in preparing a little something for that, I talked to Tim Ballard about the subject, and he said the second largest criminal crime in San Diego County is child trafficking.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. Most people don't even think that. It's a huge crime all over the world, and frankly, our country. And I don't know what degree your country, but our country, in part, is a driver of that, at least from a sexual standpoint, because what happens is we become the place where a lot of those children are sold because we have a lot of wealth, and a lot of that wealth goes into folks like Epstein and Epstein's Island and those
Yep.
kinds of people
Yep.
all over New York City. We
Yep.
have problems with children who've been trafficked from other countries into New York City, and they've broken up crime rings where they've had little girls that have had sexual experiences maybe 20 or 30,000 times, and they're not even 16 years old yet.
I just want to share something. I was looking down my watch because I'm getting messages and I'm very touched by it. It's my son messaging me as we're talking about children. And it upsets me thinking about children at risk. You know, my
Yeah,
son, I'll read these messages. I think what he's saying is,
sure.
you got me a lot of stuff for my birthday. You don't need to be buying me lots of stuff for Christmas. And that's the concerns I want my child to have.
Right.
Want him to have any other concerns. And
That's a
as
well-balanced child.
well, as a parent, that's isn't that what we want, right? For our kids to be more worried about that type of stuff than the other type of stuff. And I think there is something here, and it's really important, I think, that we understand that similar to that situation in the book that you've written, where people didn't know what was going on, but when they found out what was going on, they quite rightly got outraged about it and demanded change. And I think this theme of the exploitation of children that really exists right now is another thing. And it's a very unpleasant thing for people to think about, that this is still happening.
Well, it's interesting that you said that because when Simon and Schuster was talking to me about the cover of the book, I said I want to put a child on there because it's
Yeah,
about child labor, and they said you can't. I said why? They said because people don't want to think about that.
that's
They don't
right.
want to see that beautiful little child and
That's
think
right.
that he can be abused.
Yeah,
And I said, I really want to do it. We'll make it an upbeat picture. We won't put coal all over his face,
that's
but
right.
I want people to look at that and think, this is not some foreign child that I can't relate to.
That's right.
This
I
child could
totally
be my
agree.
child.
I totally agree. And it is our child because all children are our children. That's the fundamental truth here. And we have to think in those terms. We have to think in those terms. Otherwise, we do blind ourselves and we make ourselves stupid. We've sort of run out of time, Dave. I told you we would, that we would get through the hour in no time at all, just as we get to some of the most important issues. I said to you, I mean, I don't often have a writer on this because it's more about mental health and well-being, but I have a particular interest as a clinician because of my background in child trafficking and child exploitation and child welfare. And I think we can't con ourselves that things are okay. I think what you've written, I will be reading your book, although I told you I hadn't had a chance yet, but I will definitely be reading it because
And I hope you'll promise me that you'll call me and tell me what you think.
I will, and I'll give you an honest review as well, etc. So I'll definitely read it. I'm hopefully having time over Christmas. Sort of, I'll find some time, downtime, and sit and read it because it struck me when I saw the press release. Because you're out of the ordinary for my guests. I usually have psychological therapists on and stuff like that, but it is such an important story for our times. And I don't know if
Well,
you
it's
wrote it in that way or it's just you were inspired by it, but it captures for me something of the zeitgeist of our times because of these powerful themes of migration, forced migration, child exploitation, exploitation of people, and the importance of knowledge, learning, growth, challenging authority when it's wrong, getting things changed, doing something.
well, it's a fascinating story, and
Yeah.
frankly, I loved my time in the UK doing the research on it. But
Yeah.
I would encourage you and anybody listening to take a look on Amazon at the reviews of
Yeah.
those who have read it, and there's some very interesting reviews, and it's doing well. It's a bestseller in its class on Amazon, and I hope it'll continue to do well. It's just been released, so it's a long way to go, but it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, it really is. It's a story for our times, Dave. I really do. I think so. So it's called Out of Darkness by Dave. We'll put a link to being able to buy it underneath the video. Dave, you stay there while I just wrap up. It's been
Okay.
a genuine pleasure for me
Me
to
too.
speak to you. Real, genuine pleasure. And folks, it's yet again another fantastic guest and another fantastic show. I'll see you next time on the Wellbeing Show. Do check out Dave's book and buy it. I mean, I think it's a really important story and so many themes. And I'm also still struck by your mum telling her those
That's a
stories.
fact.
It's
It
beautiful.
was touching,
It's really
touching.
beautiful. It's really beautiful. The power of story is so important. But you say that. I'm going to say goodbye to folks, and I'll catch you all on the next show.